Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Simon Goldhill. I'm the director of CRASSH, and it's my pleasure to introduce the third of the Humanitas Lectures in War Studies, sponsored by ISD and run out of CRASSH. And now, one always says it's my pleasure to introduce, and one very rarely means it. But on this occasion, I can say it with absolute sincerity. I am amazed that I am waiting with absolute anticipation to hear a third lecture about how horrible men were at a slightly earlier time. And the size of this audience, which I think has even grown since the first lecture, and despite the inclement weather, indicates that I'm not alone in that feeling. So I hope you will join me in welcoming for the third lecture, Margaret MacMillan.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you to all of you for coming out through the floods. I just hope we can get home again. Who knows what's going on outside. And thank you to CRASSH, and thank you for the Cambridge. Thank you to Cambridge for inviting me. Institute for Strategic Dialogue. Thank you all. It's a great pleasure to be here. Having been very rude about generals not adapting to technology in the 19th century, I'm now about to try it myself. So I will probably have as little success as they did. But I wanted to produce a map for you. I just thought it might be helpful to have a map as we were talking about it, and I have a couple more. Don't worry, I don't have a very long PowerPoint presentation. In my last two lectures, I was talking about the way in which the relationship between society and war was changing in the 19th century, the ways in which the notion of a subject was gradually being replaced by the notion of a citizen across Europe, and the ways in which it became expected that men would contribute to the defense of their nation, of their country, because they were citizens of it. They had some share in their own government. War was also becoming bigger, more costly, more deadly, and it was also now potentially capable of lasting longer, because the very successes that made Europe so prosperous and so powerful, that made Europe really the dominant part of the world, also made it capable of fighting for very much longer. The Industrial Revolution made it possible to move a great many more men, to equip a great many more men, and to keep them in the field for a lot longer. And so war is moving in a direction which is disturbing the war planners, disturbing those who think about war, and many of those who thought about war, of course, were opposed to war, were pacifists. Some of the best thinking about the changing nature of war in the 19th century actually comes from those who don't want war, who oppose war, who see that the costs for Europe are going to be very high indeed. War was also becoming more total. We see a move, and of course it's going to be accelerated in the 20th century, towards total war, where the old boundaries between what were permissible targets and what weren't really no longer hold. Because as societies become more and more engaged in the war effort, then attacking those societies on the home front, attacking those who are not just the combatants, but those who are in their various ways sustaining the combatants as they're in the field, becomes part of what you do in war. And so in the First World War, you get the British blockading Germany and preventing supplies from coming in, and the German population, the German civilian population, suffering as a result of that blockade. You get the increasing resort by armies throughout Europe to moving people out who they regard as being of the wrong nationality, or using people for forced labor. And of course that's going to happen on an even greater scale in the Second World War, thanks in part to the technology, which makes it easier and easier to attack, very far away, to attack those who are living in cities like Berlin or Hamburg or London or Wolverhampton. As war was changing in the 19th century, there was also a development which concerned, in particular, the military planners, and that was that it was getting easier to defend than it was to attack. And this posed a real problem for Europe's military planners, because they still thought that there were certain eternal principles of war, that the attack, the offensive, was the way to win a war, that you could have a decisive battle which would lead to the end of a war and to negotiations, that flanking movements were ways of bringing about successful victory. And so a good deal of the military thinking and education and discussion in the 19th century was devoted to trying to deal with this development, that it was now getting very costly to attack, and that the defense could inflict terrible damage on the attack, thanks in part to better weapons, to entrenchments, to things such as barbed wire. And what I'd like to do today is talk about the actual plans that were being made, and to put them in context, which is one of the reasons why I put the map up, I'd like to just explain some of the key developments that were taking place in Europe in the 2 decades before 1914. A number of shifts were taking place on the international scene. At the beginning of the 1890s, Germany failed to continue its reinsurance treaty with Russia. Now, there were already strains in the relationship between Germany and Russia, but this had been a key part of what Bismarck had hoped to do, that he'd hoped to keep Germany's Eastern Front secure, he'd hoped to build a relationship, maintain a relationship with another conservative monarchy. And for reasons, I think, which are as much carelessness as anything else, the Germans let the reinsurance treaty lapse. Now, you could argue that this was perhaps going to happen anyway, that Germany and Russia had a number of issues between them which were causing difficulties, but you do get a decisive move of Russia away from what had been an old understanding with Germany in the 1890s. What you also get is the end of French isolation. Part of Bismarck's system had been designed to keep France isolated without any really serious allies, to keep the French in a position where they weren't able to even contemplate revenge against Germany. And what you got at the beginning of the 1890s was the development, at first a secret military alliance, and then a friendship which went through various levels between France and Russia. Increasingly, the French were lending money to Russia. Russia had a great need of capital as it was expanding. It needed to build its infrastructure, and the French had a great deal of money to lend. And so you begin to get a very strong financial relationship between France and Russia. You also get the two countries discussing shared military objectives. This, in turn, perturbs the Germans, who increasingly see themselves as encircled. And of course, we have to remember that in those days, Germany had a common border with Russia. And so one of the nightmares of German military planners was of France attacking through Alsace and Lorraine, the provinces that Germany had taken from France in 1871, and of Russia attacking on the other side. And what increasingly perturbed German military planners by 1914 was that Russia was developing so fast. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905 was a setback, a very serious setback for Russia, but Russia was recovering fast, and by 1914 was building railways, thanks in part to huge French loans, and was increasingly able to put into the field very large armies and move them up to the frontiers. You also got Britain moving away from a position of isolation. British policy in the 19th century had been not to get involved with the continent, to look in a bemused and perhaps slightly contemptuous way at what was going on the continent of Europe, and to be very glad that the channel lay between them and the foreigners on the other side. An attitude which we may see sometimes today, particularly in the coalition. But you got the British beginning to realize that isolation, splendid isolation as someone called it, was perhaps not going to work for the 20th century. The British were beginning to realize by the end of the 1890s just how friendless they were. Isolation by choice was one thing, not having anyone who very much liked you or wanted to be friends with you was very much a different thing. British relations with the United States were very bad, and in the 1890s there was real talk of war over Venezuela border issues. Venezuela shared a border with British Guiana, and there was a border dispute, and there was talk, rash talk in both Washington and London, of the possibility of a war between Britain and the United States. In that case, it didn't happen, and the British moved to mend fences with the United States and eventually made it perfectly clear that they really had no further interest in the Caribbean or in North America. They were not prepared to defend the Canadian colonies. They withdrew, essentially leaving the United States with a free hand. The South African War, which started in 1899, was also a very serious moment for the British. Not only were their troops being defeated on the ground by a very much smaller force, two very much smaller countries, but it was quite clear that many people around the world were very pleased to see this happening. Across the continent, there was great enthusiasm for the Afrikaners, or the Boers as they were known at that time, and a great deal of criticism of Britain. There was even a new fashion in Paris, a sort of gray hat folded up, which was called a chapeau à la Boer. which temporarily became fashionable among French women. At the Paris Exposition of 1900, two very small pavilions representing the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, the small Afrikaner republics, were flocked by French visitors who cheered every time they saw an Afrikaner come out. I mean, it was very much a demonstration of sympathy and very much directed against Britain. And the British were also concerned about colonial rivalries with France and with Russia. In 1898, the French and the British came close to war over Fashoda on the Upper Nile. There was talk in both countries of war. There was serious concern in the French coastal ports along the channel that the British were going to try a sudden naval attack and perhaps an amphibious landing. And in Britain, you got scare stories about French invasion plans, many of which really caused concern and not to say panic among the British. The British also had serious issues with Russia. The Russians had been moving southwards and eastwards, and of course coming closer to the jewel in the crown of British India. And the British were very concerned by this, very concerned by Russian moves into the north of Persia as well. And so the British began to not only mend fences with powers like the United States, but began to look tentatively for friends in the world. And the first very small move they made towards this was to make an alliance with Japan in 1902. And it was an alliance that was confined to East Asia. I think its significance was not so much in East Asia, although it did have significance there, but it was an indication that Britain was moving away from what up to this point had been a fairly firm policy of not having alliances, particularly in peacetime. What also helped to persuade the British that they need to move in the direction of looking for friends was the decision by the German government, and in my view it's a very important decision, to start building a large navy, to start building big battleships, to in effect challenge the British for their dominance of the seas. And the Germans could say all they liked, that they were only building a navy to protect their own trade, that they were building a navy so that they could build a colonial empire. But geography meant that that navy would sail out from the Baltic, or when the Kiel Canal was open, would sail out and right towards Britain. And so there was very real concern in Britain about what this meant. Admiral Tirpitz, who presided over the tremendous naval expansion, argued that building a big navy would force the British to become friends with Germany. And this was Tirpitz's famous risk theory. He argued that we will build a navy powerful enough that the British won't want to take us on. Our navy will probably never be bigger than the British Navy or even a match for it, but Britain has other enemies. And so if the British take on the German Navy, in so doing it will weaken itself to the point where it will then be at the mercy of the French, the American, the Italian, possibly even the Austro-Hungarian or the Japanese navies. And so Tirpitz argued, and his master Wilhelm II seems to have agreed with him, we will force the British to become friends with us. We will force the British, by building a big navy, to realize that they have to become friends with us, they have to give us a free hand, both in building a colonial empire and possibly a free hand on the continent. Well, in fact, it was a very, very serious miscalculation, because what the British did is decide, first of all, to outbuild the Germans, which is what they did, and effectively, I would argue, by about 1910, the British had won the naval race, but more importantly, perhaps, it persuaded the British that they needed to look for friends, not allies, but friends closer to hand. And so in 1904, the British settled their outstanding colonial issues with the French and formed the Entente Cordiale. And although Sir Edward Grey, who became Foreign Secretary in the new Liberal government of 1906, argued that this was simply an understanding, that the British had absolutely no commitments, that they were not getting themselves involved in any sort of military dealings with France. In fact, I think he was somewhat disingenuous. The French certainly expected that the British now would come to their aid, or at least fervently hoped that the British would come to their aid. And British and French military conversations began, which again, if they were resulted in no formal agreement, certainly gave the French the very strong impression that if a war came, the British would do something. I mean, these were detailed military conversations, detailed to the point of determining which ports the British Expeditionary Force would land in, where the depots would be, where the soldiers would be moved. So very, very, really sort of a sense was built up, certainly on the French side, and I think in the British military as well, that the two nations would work together should war come against Germany. And then, of course, in 1907, under a certain amount of pressure from the French, the British also moved to settle their outstanding colonial differences with Russia, and so you got a friendship developing between Russia and Britain. Friendship with many difficulties, but nevertheless, really a diplomatic revolution in Europe. And so Britain, France, and Russia, by 1907, are drawing closer together, and this, of course, deepens German fears, deepened Germans' concerns about being encircled, and the Germans, for their part, begin to look for allies who they hope they can rely on. Their closest ally is Austria-Hungary, and this relationship, which is never an easy one, nevertheless does survive a number of storms and strains, with the result that by 1914, the Germans really find themselves firmly committed to Austria-Hungary. And as one German statesman says, the trouble is, who else do we have? Which in a way is a very dangerous state to be in. By moving and allying themselves so closely with Austria-Hungary, of course, they take on Austria-Hungary's quarrels in the Balkans, quarrels with Russia. And so the division of Europe into these two alliance systems, they're not firm alliances in all cases. The British never sign an alliance. The Italians, although they are part of the Triple Alliance, always make it clear that they have real reservations about fighting for Austria-Hungary, who in fact many Italians regard as their hereditary enemy. So these are not tight systems, and I don't think in themselves they bring about war, but they are tending to increase apprehension in Europe, tending to give the sense that Europe is now in some ways dividing itself up and preparing for war. While the alliance systems are in the process of developing, and I think it's important to stress that they could always have changed. I mean, there were always talks across the alliances. The British and the Germans continued to talk. The Austrians and the Russians continued to talk, although after 1908, not as much, after the Bosnian crisis. But there were always the possibilities that sides might shift. I mean, one of the great fears of the French was that the Russians would go back to their older friendship with Germany. And the Italians always made it clear that they would keep a free hand, and in fact did. When the First World War broke out, the Italians did not enter on the side of Austria-Hungary and Germany. But the alliance systems, loose as they were and capable of being changed as they were, I think did tend to give an impression that Europe was in some crucial way dividing itself up. And that was strengthened by defense spending in the years immediately before the First World War. Defense spending across Europe was growing, particularly that of the great powers. It increased by 50% between 1908 and 1914. And in certain of the smaller powers, there was also marked increases. Serbia, for example, was spending a lot on armaments. And then the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 set off a fresh round of defense spending. I'll just give you a couple of figures. Germany in 1911 was spending £88 million per year on the military. In 1913, that had gone up to £118 million. Russia, in the same period, from 1911 to 1913, went from 74 million to 111 million. And that, of course, was deep concern to the German High Command, which in 1914 was calculating in a gloomy sort of way that if that rate of Russian spending went on, Germany would not be able to fight Russia by 1917. And that put real pressure, of course, when the crisis came, for Germany to fight then rather than wait. Rather the same sort of calculation that Japan was going to make in 1941 when it looked at the United States. You also got the increased involvement of public opinion in public affairs, and this, as I've said before, was not necessarily a force for peace. You got public worries, public concerns, you got a heightened nationalism in many countries, a sense that we have hereditary enemies who we need to deal with. And public opinion could play a role in pushing governments to spend more on armaments. In 1912, an army league was founded in Germany to push for a bigger army. They wanted the army to recruit more conscripts every year, to grow in size. It had 40,000 members by the spring. By 1913, it had 300,000 members. And so this was an important group. And whatever the government did, the Army League would say it was never enough. And they were very good now at manipulating public opinion. It was also encouraged, public opinion also was seized by these invasion scares from time to time. The British, of course, had always had fears of the French invading, and then after the Entente Cordiale, the potential invader became Germany. And there were also absurd stories. My favorite one is the German waiters around Britain who were really officers in disguise. And you could imagine, you could do a Monty Python sketch of the German captain waiting on a table somewhere in Soho and ordering people to finish up their cabbage or their Brussels sprouts. But there were these fears, and we can laugh at them now, but I think these were things that concerned the public and helped to put pressure on the government. And so you got a significant increase in spending in the years immediately before the First World War. The Germans in 1913 brought in both new Navy and Army bills, which marked a significant increase both in spending and in the size of the Army. In 1914, the Russians introduced something called the new 10-year program of increases, and in fact, they'd already begun to implement it the year before. One of the things they were doing was keeping their conscripts in longer, which had the effect of increasing the size of their armies. In 1913, France passed a 3-year service law to extend the service of the French conscripts from 2 years to 3 years, and this was in part to make up for the demographic shortfall, which France by now was very, very concerned about. And there simply were fewer French babies, fewer French male babies being born every year. Well, both male and female, fewer potential soldiers and fewer potential mothers for soldiers of the future. And this gap between the French birth rate, which was increasing, and the German birth rate was one that caused considerable concern in France, and of course was going to cause considerable concern after the First World War. You also got some very dangerous rivalries in those years immediately before the First World War. People beginning, or nations beginning to circle around the Ottoman Empire, which it was confidently expected was not going to last much longer. And of course, in the Balkans, you got a very dangerous rivalry between Russia and Austria-Hungary for control of that very important part of the world. What you also got, and I think you see this very clearly in the case of Russia, was you got the smaller powers in some ways leading their great patrons by the nose. Serbia, I think, acted with a sort of freedom because it felt that Russia was behind it and was possibly bolder than it might have been. I mean, it so often seems to me the case in international relations that the clients of great powers actually manage to do very much what they want, rather than the great powers telling them what to do. And for the great powers, it becomes, of course, a matter of prestige. They have to support the smaller power because otherwise they look weak, and as if they don't support those. There was also dangerous rivalry opening up between France and Russia again in Persia. And in the British Foreign Office, you had people saying, rather gloomily in 1914, we're not sure how much longer this relationship with Russia is going to last, that it may well break up. And so there were a number of tensions around Europe, not all of them which were going to lead to war, but certainly a feeling, I think, in many Europeans that things were getting difficult, that there were unresolved issues which could potentially lead to war. It was also a series of crises from 1908 onwards, or even earlier if you take the first Moroccan crises, where increasingly you get talk of war. I think you get a dangerous habituation in Europe before 1914 that war is going to come. It's probably a good thing to get it over. And an image that is frequently used in this period is of a storm. It's an oppressive atmosphere. It's like the day a thunderstorm is about to break. In a way, it's a relief to get it over, a relief to have the thunderstorm break. There was also, I think, very dangerous two consequences of these crises, and I won't enumerate them all, but if you think of the first Moroccan crisis, the Bosnian crisis of 1908, the second Moroccan crisis of 1911, and then, of course, the two Balkan wars of 1912 and 1913, I see really two main consequences from these crises. One, and they're not in some ways the same, one was that bluff and deterrence worked. In the crises, you would get the powers using measures such as moving troops up to the frontiers, or calling back a class of conscripts, or keeping a class of conscripts in longer, or doing such things as ordering more cavalry mounts in a very obvious way. And these were sort of war measures short of actually mobilizing and moving to the frontier, but they were used as a way of putting pressure on the other. In 1908, Germany issued a direct threat to Russia over the Bosnian crisis, and basically said, we will not answer for the consequences if you don't back down on this and don't agree to accept that Austria-Hungary has annexed Bosnia. And so what people seem to learn from the crises that took place before 1914, that you could actually bluff the other side, you could show your muscles, you could make some warlike moves, and you could force the other side to back down. The great problem, of course, with that is what if the other side calls your bluff? What do you do then? Because deterrence and bluff really don't work a second time. If you've bluffed unsuccessfully, next time you're not going to be as effective. I don't know how many of you discovered the most wonderful time waster. It's something called Ngram. Has anyone found Ngram? It's a Google thing. And if you type in Ngram, you can find it. What it does, you can search for occurrences of words in a number of European languages, English, German, French, Russian, over defined periods. And I thought I would look up bluff. And I found some wonderful, I did bluff from 1800 to 1914. The word was scarcely used in German before 1890. And then between 1900 and 1910, there's a very sharp spike. Scarcely used in French before 1890. By 1914, the use of bluff in French, and the word seems to have been imported from English into French, it was between 1890 and 1914, the use of the word bluff in French was up by 150%. Now, I mentioned this to someone the other day, and they said they were probably all playing board games. But I suspect there was really something here to do with sort of international relations. The second way in which this series of crises, I think, affected the frame of mind of those who were making the decision was that they left in certain quarters a determination not to be humiliated again. If you were a country or a power or a statesman who'd had to back down, you naturally enough didn't want to do it again. After the Bosnian crisis, when Russia had been obliged to back down, the Tsar wrote to his mother, "It is quite true that the form and method of Germany's action, I mean towards us, has been simply brutal, and we won't forget it." And I do think this helps to add to the factors that come into play in the crisis of 1914. I think what you also get, and this is perhaps truer among the military as a third consequence of these period of crises, is a disdain for the peaceful settlement of issues. In the German army, you get officers calling Wilhelm the Timid. And this is something I think which really stings, because for Wilhelm, Kaiser Wilhelm, the army had always been something where he had felt a tremendous rapport. The happiest time of his life, he always said, was when he was a young man training as an army officer. And to know that his own officers in his own beloved army were calling him the Timid for backing down, I think, did sting. You also got, again, I'm not saying this was only true in Germany, but you certainly got evidence of young German officers saying, "We really hope we get a chance to fight the British, bring it on. They've got a pathetic little expeditionary force, we'll round them up in 2 minutes and send them back to the Channel." And so you get, I think, a strong psychological preparedness in Europe for war. Not everyone wants it, but there's just simply a sense that war is something that's probably coming. In 1912, General Joffre, Joseph Joffre, the French chief of staff, was asked if he thought much about war. And his reply, I think, is instructive. "Yes, I think about it. I think about it all the time. We shall have it. I will make it. I will win it." And I do think that is not a single person. There were many who felt like this. I think you also had concerns, particularly among those responsible for wars, that their publics might not fight. And that is something I talked about the other day. And I think it's one of the reasons why there was so much stress on the offensive, that the offensive is a way of bringing the nation together, encouraging people to work together. What was also, of course, extremely important was that governments should be able to show their own people that they were obliged to go and fight because of what others had done. And they did so with such success that all the major powers went into the First World War with publics that thought that they were moving into war to defend themselves against unwarranted attacks from abroad. The fears of war and the fears that the public would not be ready to fight them, of course, was something that affected German military training, European military training. And I talked a bit last week about how there was tremendous stress on psychological factors. And I just want to remind you again of the sort of thinking. Colonel Louis de Grandmaison, who was one of the leading French military theorists of the pre-war period, said, "There are no other factors in the end than psychology." And let me quote directly, "For all others, weaponry, maneuverability, influence only indirectly by provoking moral reactions. The human heart is the starting point of all questions of war." And that was something which, while not widely shared, but it was something that I think a number of people felt. They felt it was perhaps a way of overcoming the increasing power of the defense to try and use psychology and instilling patriotic emotions in people. And of course, we all know what happened in the First World War. as a French general reportedly said after the dreadful Battle of Verdun, which consumed so many lives, 3 men and a machine gun can stop a battalion of heroes. And I think this stress on psychology was going to contribute to the catastrophe of 1914, 1918. Let me look now in some detail at the actual plans. And by 1900, virtually every European army, including the British with some reluctance, had increasingly developed the general staff. The general staff was really like the brain that operated a very large dinosaur, that when you had these increasingly large armies, it became absolutely essential that you had people who could plan, who could organize, who could look after things such as mobilization and railway timetables. What they had to do was be prepared for a war to start, and you couldn't improvise on the fly. When you're calling up that many men, getting them into the uniforms, getting them to the right depots, getting them to the right railways, making sure all their equipment and their ancillary units are with them, you have to have the plans ready beforehand. And of course, what became extremely important was that you should use the railways properly, because the railways were the key way of moving the troops to the battlefield. Once they got there, of course, they by and large resorted to the old traditional methods of marching, but getting vast numbers of men up to the position where they could get onto the battlefields was where you needed the railways. The German General Staff, which in many ways was the model for general staffs across Europe, had a very, very high quality railway section. In 1914, it had over 80 men, highly qualified. Its head, General Groene, was passionate about railways. Apparently, as a young officer, he used to spend weekends with his wife making railway timetables for fun. And as I mentioned before, if you didn't plan ahead, you could find yourself in a catastrophic situation, as Napoleon III did when he moved troops down to Italy in 1859, and of course as the Russians did when they tried to move troops out to the east in the Russo-Japanese War. What general staffs also did, besides planning and preparing for war, of course, is gather intelligence to try and find out what the plans of the enemy might be. And often they had very good intelligence. The French were pretty well aware of German plans to attack through Belgium and sweep down into, let me see, I think I may now move to my new technology. Oh, this is General Schlieffen. I'll come back to him in a minute. But this is the German plan. If you don't mind, I'll call it the Schlieffen plan for convenience, although there is a huge controversy going on which argues that it shouldn't be called that at all. But since we all know it as that, I'm going to call it that. And what the Germans looked at, the general staff, was they knew that the French had built very strong lines of fortresses through Alsace and Lorraine along the common border, that Paris itself was very well defended, and French fortress building had always been very good, and they were strengthening their defenses in the years just before 1914. So the German plan, you can see, was to come through Belgium and come through Luxembourg, sweeping round with a great right wing. The sleeve of the furthest most soldier would brush the English Channel, it was said, sweeping around with a great right wing, possibly enveloping Paris, at which point the Germans, it was confidently hoped, would surrender because they would be surrounded, and the Germans by this point would be able to thrust through Lorraine, and so the French would be caught in a great sort of pincer movement. The French actually had a very good idea that this is what the Germans were up to. French officers used to go to Belgium. They used to go bicycling along the Rhine in Germany. They did notice that the railway platforms in very small German villages were getting very long. They noticed that the bridges over the Rhine were being doubled in size. They noticed that there seemed to be railways running to parts which didn't have any industrial or commercial or urban needs. They also got details, in some cases, from spies. There was a wonderful spy who appeared with very heavy bandages around his head and a big hat, who handed over considerable details of early versions of the German war plans. The French had also broken a number of the German codes, but there was a failure to share information. The French Foreign Ministry had broken one set of codes, and the French military had broken another set, and they didn't trust each other, so they didn't share the information, rather like the CIA and the FBI in the United States today. The French agents managed to get details of German war games in 1912 and 1913, which gave, again, a very clear sense of what the Germans were planning. and they got a fairly complete set of the last plans as they were drawn up before 1949. The trouble was always with intelligence is could they believe them? And Joffre and others tended to assume that the Germans were actually planting these and that they couldn't trust what their own spies were telling them. And so the French continued to plan, in spite of mounting evidence that the main German attack was coming through the Low Countries, the French continued to plan on a major thrust through Lorraine. So that what the effect would have been, and very nearly was, that as the Germans were coming behind them, the French would have been pushing towards the German frontiers, leaving their rear exposed. There was a joke in Europe that there were 5 perfect things in the Europe of 1900: the Curia of the Catholic Church, the British Parliament, the Russian Ballet, the French Opera, and the German General Staff. And the German General Staff was, I think, clearly the best in Europe. It was large, it was professional, it was cohesive, it worked over the plans year by year by year. General von Schlieffen, who was its head until his retirement in, I'm trying to remember, 1905, was obsessed with this need to come up with a plan that would protect Germany. And of course, he dealt with the fundamental problem that all German military had to deal with, that Germany was likely to have to fight a war on 2 fronts. It was facing an enemy in Russia, which was getting stronger year by year, and it was facing a determined enemy in France, which of course had not forgotten its defeat in 1870, 1871. And so Schlieffen spent his life as chief of the General Staff trying to develop plans that would try at least to ensure a victory for Germany. He himself seems to have been rather pessimistic about it, but he seems to have seen no way forward but to plan for a 2-front war. He was totally focused on things military. There is a story that they were out on a ride one morning, he was with his aides, and an aide said, look at that sun glinting, look at the sun glinting on that river in the distance. And Schlieffen looked at it and he said, an unimportant obstacle. Every night when he went home, he would read military history for an hour to his 2 daughters. We actually have no record, I think we don't have a record of what the daughters thought about this, but they were good daughters and listened. He assumed that the principles of he assumed that the principles of war were as they had always been, that you had to win a war by going on the offensive, and that the attack from the flank was likely to be the one that succeeded. In 1893, he wrote, "The armament of the army has changed, but the fundamental laws of combat remain the same, and one of those laws is that one cannot defeat the enemy without attacking." He also feared, as did other German military leaders, that a war of attrition would exhaust Germany, exhaust its resources. Feared also that it would lead to the deepening of the social divisions which were already so apparent in Germany. He then devoted his career to trying to work out what would be the most effective plan for Germany to win such a war. And he thought at first of fighting in the east against Russia, of knocking Russia out, Russia as the less developed partner of the Franco-Russian alliance. But gradually, he came around to thinking that he would destroy France first, or destroy the French armies first. By the end of the 19th century, he had switched his attention, or not switched his attention, but he had fixed on a quick war against France, and then moving the German troops over to the east. He felt that Russia could be held off. It would take longer to get up to the frontiers, given its distance, given its relative lack of railways. And so his plan, his final sort of concept, it wasn't really a fully developed plan before he retired in 1905, was to attack France through the Low Countries. 4/5 of the French forces would be deployed in the west, while the remaining 1/5 would be deployed in the east. It is said that his last words before he died was, "Only keep the right wing strong." But like many last words, it's not clear that he actually ever said them. In his last war game before he retired in 1905, he did explore the possibility of a defensive war, but he decided it was not worth it. And Germany really did not seriously consider fighting on the defensive after this period. His plan was elaborated and developed by this man after his retirement, his successful General von Moltke the Younger, who has often been blamed for destroying what was a master plan. And when Germany lost the First World War, a number of German generals said we would have won if only von Moltke had not tinkered with what was a perfect plan. And I think this is deeply unfair. Von Moltke inherited a concept, he didn't inherit a fully developed plan, and there were problems with it. Schlieffen was making a number of assumptions which the Germans simply didn't have enough force to carry out. He was also risking, of course, bringing Britain into the war because Belgium was a neutral country and its neutrality had been guaranteed by, among others, Prussia, which became part of Germany, and so the Germans took on that obligation, and by Britain itself. But neither Schlieffen nor Moltke seem to have taken that concern all that seriously. But what Moltke did was move. Part of the German advance was going to come through the Netherlands, and he removed the Netherlands part of the advance. He decided to leave the Netherlands alone, which I think reveals his underlying pessimism. He said that the Netherlands can be the windpipe through which Germany can be supplied, which indicates that he was thinking that the war might turn into a longer war than the plan itself seemed to suggest. And the plan, as it was finally developed, assumed that within 40 days after the hostilities started, German troops would be at Paris, and the Germans would be in a position to force a French surrender and then begin rapidly moving troops eastwards to the Eastern Front. There were critics of the plan. There were those who said Germany didn't have sufficient force to make it work. There was also a German general who said, I think wisely, you cannot carry away the armed strength of a great power like a cat in the bag. If the French army or the French armies surrendered, would that in fact be the end of the war? It hadn't been the end of the war when the Germans had forced a French surrender at Sudan in 1870. French irregulars had fought on, and there had been, for Germany and for France both, a rather costly low-level struggle which had gone on. The Germans seem not to have planned for a longer war. They seem to have assumed that defeat on the battlefield, a dramatic defeat on the battlefield, would lead France to sue for peace. In September 1914, when their armies had won a series of victories, the German generals discovered that they had no plans for an extended war if France refused to capitulate. And so I think the Schlieffen plan was one of those things which was absolutely marvelous. It looked wonderful on paper, it made all sorts of sense, but it didn't allow for the French not behaving as expected. And of course, it didn't allow for what Clausewitz always called friction, that when you actually start putting plans into operation, all sorts of things will happen which will slow them down, change them, impede them. There was also, I think, a real problem in the German planning, and that was that the civilian politicians either refused to inform themselves about what was in the German plan or simply thought that it was not their job. The political implications of violating Belgian neutrality were potentially catastrophic for Germany. That if it brought Britain in, the British would be able to use their navy and their old naval weapon of the blockade. They'd be able to bring to bear the resources of a very large empire indeed. And the military refused to consider those implications because their view was that you were here to work out the best way to win a war. And the civilian leaders, I think, dangerously in Germany, simply acquiesced in this view that there is something called the military sphere and there is something called the civilian sphere. In 1900, when Holstein, who was the eminence grise of the German Foreign Office at the time, learnt that Schlieffen was considering, and the General Staff were considering, violating Belgian neutrality and possibly other international agreements, he thought about it and then said the next day, if the Chief of the General Staff, particularly such a preeminent strategical authority as Schlieffen, considers such a measure imperative, then it is the duty of diplomacy to concur in it and to facilitate it in every possible manner. In 1919, after the war was over and Germany was facing the meaning of defeat, Bethmann Hollweg, who had been Chancellor for the period before the war and for a brief period, for a certain period during the war itself, said, and you wished in a way he thought of it before, no reasonably serious observer could have failed to appreciate with the utmost clarity the enormous perils of a two-front war. But, he then went on, for the civilian side to have tried to foil a thoroughly thought-out military plan described as absolutely essential would have entailed an intolerable responsibility. And German civilians did not want to take on that responsibility. There were other problems with the German planning as well. The General Staff had made its plans, but there was virtually no coordination with the Navy. Tirpitz claimed, and his claims are not always entirely reliable, but he claims he did not know what the German military plans were when war broke out in 1914. Nor did the General Staff coordinate with the Kaiser's military cabinet, the commanding officers of the army corps who'd be responsible for carrying out the plan, or with the various ministries of wars of the German states. The Prussian Ministry of War, of course, was the largest, and the smaller ministries of wars throughout the component states of Germany, which were responsible for the size of the army, for its armaments, and for some aspects of its mobilization. And so I think you got a very dangerous situation where you had this brilliant General Staff, which was meticulous in its planning, which had worked out this plan which they hoped would guarantee Germany victory, and a real failure of coordination and lack of consultation. The Germans tended to look on their ally Austria-Hungary as rather hopeless. They felt that the people in Austria-Hungary didn't have the right attitudes, weren't serious enough, but what other ally did they have? And so in spite of repeated sort of gloomy reports by the German military attachés on the preparedness of the Austro-Hungarian army, the Germans actually felt they were going to have to count on it. The trouble is, what the Germans wanted Austria-Hungary to do was not what Austria-Hungary itself was necessarily going to want to do. What the Germans wanted Austria-Hungary to do was hold off Russia if a general war broke out for long enough for Germany to defeat France and then begin switching troops to the Eastern Front. What Austria-Hungary wanted to do was from time to time deal with its many other enemies. And Austria-Hungary had a great many enemies thanks to geography. Yes, they did want to deal with Russia, but increasingly they and the chief of the Austrian General Staff, Konrad von Hotzendorf, became fixated on destroying Serbia, which was a very different question. What Konrad did, in fact, in 1914 was move a significant part of his army down to take on Serbia. When the Germans protested, he then put them on trains and began moving them north to deal with Russia, with the result that a great many of the best Austrian troops were in railway carriages when they could actually have been fighting against Russia in the north, or when they could have been fighting against Serbia in the south. I think there was a certain lack of candor between the two sides. The Austrians repeatedly said to the Germans, yes, yes, of course, we'll move troops up to fight Russia, while intending, in fact, to move them down to fight Serbia. And the Germans repeatedly said to Austria-Hungary, don't worry, we will help relieve the pressure on you on the front against Russia by attacking from East Prussia down into Russian Poland, without, in fact, really intending to do very much at all of the sort. I mean, the German obsession was with defeating France. They believed that they could then, at their leisure, or a certain amount of leisure, defeat Russia. On the Allied side, you had less meticulous planning. I mean, Germany's was by far the most detailed plan and the most well thought out plan. The French wanted, of course, any war to involve Russia. And for the French, it was extremely important to keep Russia happy and bring Russia into a war as soon as possible. And the French had a, I think, very good sense that the bulk of the German attack would come on them first. And so what they badly needed was Russia to mobilize as quickly as possible, which was a problem, of course, in Russia, given the distances and the relatively undeveloped state of the Russian railway, and attack Germany and Austria-Hungary as soon as possible to relieve pressure on France. What the French also worried about was that as Russia got stronger and stronger, it would need France less. And so one of the French nightmares was that Russia would reach the point where it was strong enough that it was not going to need any sort of French alliance. The French assumed that they would attack, in spite of the very clear, I think, evidence that the Germans were planning this huge sweeping movement through the Low Countries. They continued to assume that they would attack into Lorraine. They made a number of assumptions about what the Germans would do, which I think gave them the confidence they could attack into Lorraine. They assumed that the Germans would not be able to go that far west in Belgium, because they didn't think Germany had enough forces. So they felt that they wouldn't be dealing with as big an attack coming through Belgium as, in fact, they did have to deal with. And the reason they made this assumption was because they assumed that the Germans would not put reservists into the front line. The French tended to have a low opinion of their own reservists, who they felt had been too much in civilian life, were too soft, weren't really good soldiers. And the French army always intended to use its reservists to do things like guarding depots, looking after hospitals, manning railway lines, protecting railway lines. They assumed the Germans would do the same. And so the French consistently underestimated just how formidable and strong the German attack was going to come. On the other hand, I think the great advantage the French had is their plans were flexible. Joffre, in fact, refused to give his military, his generals, very, very clear directives. He said, I'll tell you where to go. I want you to get up to the frontier. I'll give you some alternatives which we might decide on, but I'm not going to tell you now what we're going to do. And this sounds rather vague, and a lot of people complained about it, but in fact it was a rather sensible policy. Let me just quickly say what the Russians were planning to do, and there was a great deal of debate in Russia about what they should do. Often very gloomy debate, because the Russians, when they started totting up their potential enemies, had a list that went on and on. I mean, at one point they seriously thought they might have to fight Japan, China, the Ottoman Empire, Sweden, Austria-Hungary, and Germany. They remained obsessed with the Swedes up until 1914. In the end, the Swedes did not attack Russia. By 1914, however, the Russians had assumed that they would have to fight in the West. They had more or less got a sort of standoff with Japan in the Far East. They were less worried about that than they had been. The question was, where would they fight? And in the end, what they did is make the worst of all possible decisions. They decided they could, well, they didn't think they could, but they decided they would fight both Germany and Austria-Hungary. They divided their forces so that they were not strong enough in either theater to defeat Germany or Austria-Hungary. In retrospect, what they probably should have done was concentrate on Austria-Hungary, which was the weaker of the two powers, where they had a chance of defeating it. What they decided in 1912 is that they'd attack both Austria-Hungary and Germany, thereby dividing their forces and almost ensuring that they would not have a very clear, they would not have a clear victory. They should have known better. They had a very clear idea of what Austria-Hungary's and Germany's plans were, again, thanks to spies. But I think there was a certain recklessness in Russian military planning, that they simply felt that they probably had to fight. And there was a dangerous feeling among some of the top leadership in Russia that the regime was doomed unless they showed themselves to be active, and that they may be doomed anyway, but at least in a war gave them some sort of chance for victory in bringing the country together. And then you had the British plans, which were never terribly well elaborated. I mean, the British tended to assume that the Navy would be the most important arm in the war. But increasingly, there were these talks, these commitments, even though they were not in writing, that the British Expeditionary Force would go to France and would fight with the French forces. The Navy hadn't really taken this in, and there was, in fact, a very embarrassing meeting in August 1911 during the Second Moroccan crisis, when a committee was, a cabinet committee was called to consider what Britain's strategy in a war should be. And it became completely clear that while the Army was planning to send an expeditionary force to France, the Navy had absolutely no plans and no interest in transporting that force or protecting it. And so there was a slight moment of embarrassment, and a number of resignations took place hastily. Winston Churchill came in as first Lord of the Admiralty, and the Navy, much to its dismay, found itself in the position of having to support the British Expeditionary Force if war came. So on the eve of the Great War, the plans were, some of them good, some of them bad, some of them drawn up in great detail, like the German plans. I think you've got a serious problem in a number of countries that the civilians had simply not looked enough at what the military were planning, had not chosen to understand what it was that their military were planning. And in the crisis of 1914, a real abdication of responsibility, and I would argue particularly in Russia and in Germany, where the Kaiser and the Tsar both asked their military, was it possible to fight on one front only? Could we, said the Tsar in the final days of the crisis, fight only Austria-Hungary and not go to war with Germany? And Kaiser Wilhelm asked a similar question of von Moltke, could we fight just against Russia and not have to go to war with France? And in both cases, they were told, no, it's impossible. The plans have been made. If we try and change them now, it would be disaster. And I think they didn't have the backbone, I suppose one could say, to challenge that. And so Europe, with some of its best brains working on these plans, with its wonderful technology, with its superb industrial organization, with its wonderful communications networks, went into a war in 1914 where all of these things helped to produce a stalemate. There's a lot of debate about whether the war could have been won in the first few months. My own sense it is perhaps wasn't possible. And they found themselves by the late autumn of 1914, particularly on the Western Front where the distances were shorter, in a stalemate. There's a story, which I think is true, that Jean Jaurès, the great French socialist who was assassinated on the eve of the war as he was trying desperately to avert it, had worked as a man with a young army captain. Like a lot of pacifists, Jaurès took war very seriously, and so he worked with this young captain to try and understand what war was about. And they drew up a book or a series of writings about what a future war would look like. They warned about a stalemate. The young captain, Henri Girard, then ended up on the Western Front, and he was sitting there sometime in 1915, and a friend said, "Why are you staring into space like this? You seem very lost in thought." And Girard replied, "I feel as though all this is familiar to me." Jaurès prophesied this hell, this total annihilation. And so you get Europe moving, partly thanks to the military plans, partly, I would argue, the failures of the civilians who should have pushed harder, should have demanded more, should have insisted more, moving into a position where they had wonderful plans which in the end didn't work, and Europe had 4 years of stalemate and has never really, I think, recovered from that. Thank you.